Hi, everyone. My name is Rhett Hanscom, and I am one of the co-authors of Analyzing Twitter Users' Behavior Before and After Contact by Russia's Internet Research Agency, and I'll be walking you through this work today. So up first, let's talk about some of our motivations and goals. We'll begin with defining the IRA. So the IRA was the Internet Research Agency, and it was a Russian troll farm, which is found to have spread discourse on Twitter prior to the US presidential elections in 2016. And while other work has explored this IRA data, we really wanted to keep our emphasis on understanding the impact the IRA had on the natural users with whom they engaged on Twitter. So our approach really began when we obtained a data set from Twitter of about 3,500 accounts, which Twitter had identified as being affiliated with the IRA. So we found the users that they contacted on Twitter, and we really focused in on the most heavily contacted users. So these users were retweeted by the IRA, they were replied to by the IRA, and they were mentioned by an IRA account. So we then divided these 16,000 users into those with higher and lower following counts, and we used 5,000 as the division there. And we just wanted to understand if users with different sizes of reach on Twitter were affected differently. We then pruned for a number of unwanted features. So we removed accounts that were potentially bots. We removed accounts that had insufficient data to span an entire before and after analysis. And we also wanted to keep the emphasis of our work on US citizens prior to the presidential election in 2016. So we went ahead and removed accounts that didn't publish a majority of their tweets in English. We further divided them within their categories of lower and high follower counts into those who responded to the IRA and those who didn't. So our final bucket counts are listed here. As we can see in the low follower count groups, we have far fewer users who responded to the IRA than did not respond. And then that is emphasized even more highly in our high follower count group, where again, we've got even fewer people who responded back to the IRA as opposed to those who did not. So before we dig into the meat of our results, we're just going to unpack each of the behavioral metrics that we followed. So up first would be the monthly tweet volumes, the number of tweets a user published within a 1 month time frame. We also looked at the sentiment of tweets. So this is going to be the average sentiment of tweets for, again, a 1 month time frame. And here sentiment is defined as 1 being the most positive and -1 being the most negative, 0 being completely neutral. We also followed how often these users were tagging Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton on Twitter. We looked as well at the sentiment of the tweets which mentioned Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton. However, we will not discuss these results within this presentation today, so I'd ask you to refer to our paper for that. So we can go ahead and begin by establishing a timeline of events. First up, we'll look at the first contact distribution of our lower follower count users. So we've got the years along the x-axis and the number of users contacted for the first time within that year along the y-axis. We can see here that the IRA began activity as early as 2010. However, they really ramped up the scale of what they were doing in 2014 before they ultimately would reach the most new users in 2015. And then finally, they were removed from the platform by Twitter in 2017. We're seeing a very similar shape in the high follower count users distribution of first contact as well, where you can see them gearing up in 2014, reaching a lot of new users in 2015, and then ultimately scaling back until their removal in 2017. So that first metric that we have, the monthly tweet count, is right here. We'll look at the lower follower count users first. So when looking at these graphics, we'll see a red dotted line going down the middle, and that represents time 0 for each of these users. We've got negative numbers descending from the left and then positive numbers ascending from the right on the x-axis here, representing the number of months before and after IRA contact. And then at every x-tick, we have 2 columns. So gold are the unresponsive users and blue are the responsive users. So what we can see here is that in the months after IRA contact, the responsive users sustained an increase in Twitter activity of about 26% per month. And the unresponsive users also showed increased Twitter frequency as far as their usage in the months following at about 15.5%. If we look at the high follower count users, we can see here that they were in general more active on the Twitter platform. And the responsive users were up about 16% in the months after IRA engagement, and the unresponsive users up about 10% in the months following. And all of these results were found to be significant at the 0.05 level. We also wanted to compare with a random baseline of Twitter users to see if these results were something that was just happening in general around these times. But what we can see here, we've got the targeted users up top, and then we've got our random baseline now down at the bottom with that red triangle. So there's a pretty big separation here, whereas the average user of Twitter was just simply not as active as the users who were targeted by the IRA. If we look at sentiment, again, we'll look at the lower follower count users first. What we can see here is that the responsive users actually did exhibit slightly less positive sentiment in the months following IRA engagement. And we actually saw a slight increase in positivity with the unresponsive low follower count users. However, this specific result was not found to be significant. And again, for the high follower count users, the responsive users, slight dip in positivity. And then with the unresponsive, again, slight dip. And these all were found to be significant, except for the unresponsive low follower count users. So if again, we compare to a random Twitter group, what we have here is that the random user of Twitter is in general a little bit more positive than the users who the IRA targeted. So again, IRA targets down here, and then up by this red triangle, this is the random baseline of Twitter users. All right, so we also tracked the frequency with which these users were mentioning Donald Trump on Twitter. So with the low follower count responsive users, they were up about 66% in the months after engagement with the IRA, and the unresponsive were up about 27%. With the high follower count users, we were up about 95% in the months after IRA engagement, and the unresponsive up about 146%. All of these were found to be significant at the 0.05 level. If we look at the Hillary Clinton mentions, we can see here that she was just not mentioned with the frequency within these Twitter populations that Donald Trump was. However, the responsive users in the low follower count group were up about 55% in the months after contact, and the unresponsive users in this group were up about 15%. For the high follower count users, they were up about 102% in the responsive group, and then about 67% in the unresponsive group. All of these were significant at the 0.05 level. So what did we find here? Some key takeaways are that after IRA contact, these users sustained increased monthly tweet activity. They had increased negativity or decreased positivity, however you want to look at it. We saw increased mentions of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton after engagement with the IRA. And we saw that these changes were not necessarily generalizable to the random user of Twitter. And we did that through our random baseline comparisons. Some limitations that we had were that no causality can be claimed here. We certainly don't know that these behaviors were direct results of the contact with the IRA. We simply see that they exist in the after time and not necessarily in the before to the same degree. The data is self-reported through Twitter, and there's certainly a ton of data that we couldn't access. This is, several years after the fact, and we simply just don't have the tools to excavate all of the data that we would want to. Also, sentiment analysis can be kind of difficult to discern the direction of the sentiment. So in the future, we would love to explore the union set of users. So not necessarily the users who were contacted the most heavily, but all of the users with whom they contacted. We would love to explore topic modeling to really understand the conversations that they were having with these users. And we would love to follow these users into the 2020 election and study other election interference in general. Thank you so much for coming. That's going to wrap up our presentation today.